Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Digital Media Zone at the United Nations. We're here for the UNGAS, and joining me is Daniel Wolf. He is the director of the Harm Reduction Program at the Open Society Foundations. And he's here today to discuss drug prevention, drug treatment programs, and some of the different political opinions that he's been seeing across the globe when it comes to drug-related issues. So that's a very loaded introduction, but let's start with the treatment programs, because off stage you and I were discussing health and how there are different opinions about health and what does taking action with regard to health actually mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting at this session because there's been a universal acknowledgement that health is an important part of the response, but what we haven't talked about is what different countries think they mean when they talk about health for people who use drugs. So, for example, in a country like China or Vietnam, just on the basis of a positive urine test, just, like if you test positive for drug use, you can be sent to a treatment center, so-called treatment center, for 1, 2, 3, or even 5 years, where you are forced to labor, for example, 13 or 16 hours a day, and that's supposed to be your treatment. There's no evidence-based treatment, there's no medicine, there's no doctors, there's just discipline. Then you have countries like Europe that are providing, for example, a range of services like giving someone a clean needle in exchange for a dirty one, or giving them a medicine that relieves craving for heroin or other opiates, giving them hepatitis C medicine or HIV medicine, and that also is health. So really the big debate here is not should we be doing health, but what do we mean by health? Because in some cases health is just as punitive as prison for people who use drugs, except it's less supervised, and basically people aren't paying attention to what happens in the so-called health facilities.
So far, or I should say to date, have more countries been in favor of doing what they can when it comes to harm reduction? So, for example, you mentioned exchanging a dirty needle with a new clean needle. Mm-hmm. While that's actually still allowing drug use, but it's keeping the drug user healthier. Are countries more in favor of that or against it?
I mean, the trend is for more and more countries to be in favor of it. So even countries like China and Iran or Vietnam that you might think of as conservative countries that wouldn't permit it have actually implemented some of those programs. I think the real question is not just are you doing it, but is the whole government in favor of it? So if you show me a good harm reduction program, a needle exchange program in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, I can also show you a bunch of police waiting around the corner to grab people up and arrest them. So there's a tension between the health people and the drug control people in a lot of countries. So the real challenge for us and for the world is to say, okay, if we say we're going to take a health approach, let's make the space for people to actually be able to access the services, because no health service is going to work if people are terrified to use it. In many countries, people say, I can manage my heroin addiction without the government knowing, but if I go to a health service, I have to give my name, my family is identified. In a lot of countries, your name is added to a list, and the government keeps track of you. You're subject to stop and frisk by the police. Sometimes you can be denied a driver's license or access to a university loan or child custody. So if we make the penalties so high for people actually seeking health services, then what we're actually doing is perpetuating the problem and driving people underground and into more risk.
And you work across 23 countries, correct? Are there any harm reduction programs that really stand out to you in terms of being the most effective or creative or seeming to positively encourage people to be healthier?
There are a lot, and actually, the variation and innovation is wide. So, for example, in the Republic of Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, they have a needle exchange program in prison. Now, it's a fact that in almost all the prisons of the world, there is drug use. Unfortunately, it would be nice to say that prisons were drug-free, but in fact, even in that very controlled environment, drugs find their way in. So what Kyrgyzstan did is say, we're not going to deny it. We're actually going to provide people a way to be safe. We don't want people to come in here free from HIV or hepatitis and leave having a potentially fatal infection. So they started a program where they actually give out clean needles in prison. I should say that those kind of programs outside of prison also have not been shown to encourage or increase drug use at all, but they keep you from getting infections. In Vietnam, they're moving to community-based treatment. They had these very punitive, harsh, compulsory, long-term, basically labor camps that were treatment, and now they're saying, actually, we need to close some of those and move to try community-based treatment where you get counseling, not a beating. In Europe, well, actually, I'll go closer to home. Here in North America, in Canada, though unfortunately not here in the United States, they have supervised injection sites where people can go, they bring their drugs, but they can get both a clean needle, a clean, well-lighted place, nurses to help in case they run into any medical problems. And at first the community was horrified. They said, why are you doing this? You're going to attract people to the neighborhood. Right. You're going to send the wrong message. But the reality is that it's actually been good for public order. Like
keeping things more civilized.
Yeah, bringing people inside and giving them a safe place to do something, not hanging out on the street. But also fewer people have died of overdoses. You know, right now in the U.S., there's an overdose from opioids every 20 minutes. So while I'm talking to you, someone is going to die of an overdose. You know, if you give people services, a place to actually administer the drugs, a medicine called naloxone that can reverse the overdose, you can save lives. And, you know, we all want people to live as full, healthy lives as possible, but you can't live a full, healthy life if you're dead. And that really has to be the bottom line for the health approach.
Yeah, and so with regard to the health approach and the discussions that are happening here at the United Nations and the declaration that was discussed yesterday, what kind of progress are you seeing?
So the declaration, the UN operates on consensus. That means that, or actually every country has to agree, and that means that it only takes one country or a couple countries to drive everything to a kind of lowest common denominator general statement. That has happened here. The outcome document that will come out of this meeting is strong, but it's not as strong as it could be. And I just came from a meeting half an hour ago, for example, where I heard a representative of the Russian Federation say that she didn't believe that use of the medicines methadone and buprenorphine, which are prescribed to relieve craving for opiates, applied to Russia. And this was a meeting that Russia was sponsoring on the importance of science in addiction treatment. And to say that you don't believe that this medicine applies to you would be like saying, I don't believe that gravity applies to me. Or, I mean, for Russia to sponsor this meeting is a little bit like having a climate change denialist host a session on global warming. She basically said, I don't accept the science, I don't think it applies. I think we have to work together to make sure that people don't get to interpret things through a moral lens that are supposed to be through a health or a science lens.
Right. It's a very important distinction, the morality and then the health factor.
Yeah, unfortunately with drugs, it's one that often gets lost. Like I can't think of another medical condition where people get to make so many moral judgments in the name of health. So if I had heart disease and I went to a heart doctor and he said, oh, I only work with oral medications, but if you have a heart attack, I don't work with the paddles. I don't believe in that. You would say, are you crazy? Like, what are you talking about? You don't believe in it. You should, you know, you want to use every available means to help the patient. But with drugs, it's very common for one provider to say, oh, I only use this approach. I don't use that one. Or I will offer you counseling so that you can become drug-free, but if you're not ready to do that, I have nothing for you. Or I can give you a needle, but I won't tell you how to get connected to a drug treatment center. And what we need is to have the whole continuum. Like you would never want you, your family member, your child to be facing a situation where there was a whole range of options and you're only offered one option, which often doesn't work.
Right. So on that note, I'm going to open up for questions in the audience. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Thank you. So I'm curious, when there is so much science being done about all of this and so much evidence about these harm reduction approaches, why do you think that there is still so much reluctance to use the science and to believe in it and to, you know, even if you don't believe in it, give it a try, because obviously it's worked many places elsewhere, and yet it seems people are so stuck on this punishment idea or take away opportunities and rights of these people and put them to work, even though the approaches that they're taking haven't been shown to be effective?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I should say that I think evidence, what we say in public health training is evidence is necessary but not sufficient. Because the truth is that the way that people respond to drugs isn't just, about reading a study and reaching a conclusion. It's also about all the experiences that people have had of the anxiety or fear or about either someone who's a drug user that they have known or someone who has for whom drug use has gotten out of control. And I think we, public health experts, and I'm trained in public health, have made a mistake by only focusing on the science and not sometimes focusing on the human. So, I try to talk less about needle exchange now and more about community health and safety, because those are things that people can sort of get behind. I think that there is a tendency to treat people who use drugs like drugs themselves, as something to be controlled or contained, rather than people in need of services or who might be wanting to change their behaviors, who should be supported in that. And, I think that that's changing. There are some 70 countries now that have harm reduction explicitly in their national strategies. There was a special session almost 20 years ago in 1998, and that special session didn't mention health or harm reduction or needles or opiate substitution treatment or any of those things in the declaration. It was straight up, we aspire to eliminate drugs from the world before the next UNGAS. Of course, what ended up happening is you couldn't eliminate the drugs, but you could lock up a hell of a lot of drug users and quite a number fewer big drug dealers, because it's also the smaller, most vulnerable people who end up getting caught up in the punitive response that you described.
I want to know a bit more about the moral lens that you'd mentioned. I think you touched upon that, but can you go into more detail with more examples?
Sure.
And I wonder, during the forum, UNGAS forum, did the Vatican or any religious group speak on this topic?
So, first to the moral question, I think that what a lot of people have said over the years is that you don't want to send the wrong message about drug use. And I've had people say to me, oh, if you give someone a clean needle, it sends the message that you're giving up on them recovering. And what I would say to them is, no, when I give someone a clean needle or support someone else to do that, it sends a message that I care enough about you that I want you to be alive to make positive change. But I think there is often a sense, we often talk about like the damned and the saved. I once was lost and now I'm found. Those are the stories, and particularly, if it sounds Christian, it's because, in fact, it is a very Christian narrative, but it's also true that there are similar narratives in other countries that aren't operating through a Christian lens. But we don't talk about the many, many people in the middle. Like, the truth is that most people who use drugs, actually aren't going to develop a dependence problem or a health problem. The vast majority are going to try, experiment, age out, decide to stop without developing a problem. And also, many, many people who are dependent on drugs find themselves returning. It's not like a straight linear process. You start, you stop, you return, you stop. So I once had someone say to me, oh, you shouldn't be supporting harm reduction programs. You should be supporting programs to help people stop. And we went to Russia, and we asked people who were under 30, who were users of a needle exchange program, so tell us about your experiences seeking treatment. And most of those people had sought treatment and tried to stop 8 or 10 times before the age of 30. And the reality is, if they could have stopped with using the available resources, they would have, but they were struggling. And I think the moral thing to do is actually keep people alive and with their options open and ideally free of a potentially fatal infection, and allow them to have a sense that you care about them, even if they're doing something that isn't exactly what you would want them to be doing, or if they're not achieving a sort of a totally drug-free state. For me, it's actually moral to say, we care about you even if you're imperfect, and we're going to support you and keep your options alive, rather than saying, the only way I'm going to help you is if you're drug-free. And if you're not able to be drug-free, I'm sorry, come back tomorrow. Because that has led, unfortunately, to literally millions of infections and deaths, overdoses, people feeling worse and worse rather than better and better when they try to change their lives.
It's such a complex and multi-layered conversation. I'm glad you're here to be a
well,
guiding force.
And I should
Yeah.
say that I'm really glad that it's not only me or the health people that are here, but one of the key messages of this meeting is that drugs is too complex and layered and important an issue to be left to the drug control people. So the message of this meeting, if you go outside, there are family members here whose lives have been touched by the drug war. There are people who grow plants that are used to make illicit drugs. There are doctors, there are scientists. And I think the overarching message is drugs is a global issue, and it requires a global response, but not just the response of the drug czars and the police and the people who just say no. We have to move beyond that, and I think we are moving beyond it.
Daniel Wolf, thank you so much.
Thank you.